I started watching Jeffrey Robinson do his teachings and trainings a few years ago. And I watch him on YouTube. He got a lot of videos on YouTube. And, trying to increase my knowledge and trying to understand more, trying to be better, trying to be smarter, trying to do all of those things, I come across Jeffrey Robinson's teachings, and I start watching different ones. He's doing trainings all over the country. And then he started talking about a film that they were putting together, Who We Are. And I said, when that comes out, I'm going to see that film. I'm going to see that film. And his background, he's an attorney, been practicing here in the Seattle area for over 40 years, Harvard Law, all the pedigrees you can imagine, but really putting in the work on this to teach and train and to educate so we can all be a little bit better. And when the film came out a few months ago, our Rotary Club, Seattle 4, had a screening, and I couldn't make it because my wife and I, we had another event that night, and I said, we got to do something like this for the fire service, for local government. And then I reached out to Jeffrey and Andrea, and I said, hey, how can we do something like this for the fire service? And they said, we're more than happy to do it. And that's how we got here tonight. But before we get into our questions and our discussions, I want to take an opportunity to introduce our mayor, Mayor Bruce Harold, who's here with us tonight. And I think it's important that our mayor has committed a few hours to sit with us, to be with us tonight as we go through this time so we can all become a little bit better. And Jeffrey, we got a series of questions that we're going to ask you tonight, but all of you out there, if you have questions, we have a team out there that are going to be passing out index cards, and just put your hand up, they'll get you a card, they'll get you a pen, they'll collect the question, they're going to run them up to me, and then we're going to continue that conversation going. But we got some questions for Jeffrey tonight, and I remember when we talked, he said, hey, give me the hard ones first. He said, I don't want the slow pitch softballs, give me the 102 mile an hour fastball. This is a discussion we need to have. But I think I'm gonna probably start with the slow pitch softball because I think everybody's interested in, Jeffrey, why make the film? Why do the training? I mean, you've done over 50 of these across the country. Why?
Well, the first thing I want to say is to thank each and every one of you for coming. One of the most valuable things that any of us has is our time. And where we spend our time says something about what we value. And it was a beautiful day today, and you chose to come in here and share this experience. So I really want to thank you for that. I think, as was indicated in the film, I started doing some research because of stuff that happened in my family. And then I started putting that research together. As a criminal defense lawyer, I was always trained that if you have a complicated set of facts, put it in a timeline just to see what it does. And when I did that, the top of my head started to blow off. And that's when I started giving this presentation. And in 2017, I gave it in federal district court in Manhattan to judges and lawyers. And one of the lawyers in the room was Sarah Kunstler. And for the younger folks in the room, if you don't know the name William Kunstler, if I was a rap star, I'd say something like, if you don't know, you better ask somebody. Because William Kunstler was an iconic civil rights lawyer in the 60s and 70s. And Sarah Kunstler and her sister Emily are his daughters. Sarah happened to be in the audience, and she called me up and said, Emily and I make films, and we want to make a movie out of your presentation. And I just started laughing. And we met, we looked at our calendars, we met on June 20th, 2017, and 364 days later, we were in Town Hall Theater in New York City in front of a packed house with 7 cameras, and we filmed the stage presentation. And then for the next 3 years, I was going around the country giving this lecture, and where we would go, we would talk to people who had lived experience that connected with these stories. And that's how we put the film together. So it wasn't an intentional thing, but I will say that if you like this film, the talent of Sarah and Emily Kunstler is clear, because they took what was a PowerPoint presentation and made it into something radically different.
Thank you for that. And David's going to get a mic on you, and I think I said earlier, we're going to be recording the Q&A and the discussion, and our goal is to continue to share so we continue to learn and grow together. And sometimes you have to watch things 2 or 3 times, at least I do. I don't get it the first time. So I'm definitely going to be watching it again. But starting to get into some of the questions, Jeffrey. You know, race is a hard conversation to have. We have them in the fire department, we have them all over the city, we have them with our family and friends. And why do you think the topic of race immediately makes us uncomfortable, makes us fearful about what we may say? We don't want to, say the wrong thing or hurt someone's feelings. Why do you think that is?
You know, I think it's a parallel to so many other things in our lives that have the same impact. When there's been sexual abuse that's gone on in a family, it's really hard for the family to talk about that because it's painful, and people feel responsibility, and people feel guilt and anguish, and oh, what do I do? And we have never had a direct and honest conversation about race in this country. The closest we came was in the 60s when we started approaching that conversation, and we all saw how that ended. So, you know, to me, I think I said this in the film, it will never get easier to have a discussion about race than it is like today. Because every day that we wait, it will only get harder. And we have a laboratory experiment that we can look at called The Conditions in the United States of America, where Black America lives radically different than white America at every socioeconomic measure that you can find. And the question is, why is that? And that makes people uncomfortable, because if there's something evil behind that question, if there's an answer to why is that all of us will have to take responsibility for, that's a scary thing. And that's why I'm trying to say there are some things none of us are responsible for. Nobody in this room ever enslaved anybody. We got no responsibility for that. But we do have a responsibility to look at how that institution survived after 1865 and how it impacts today, if it does. And we've never looked at that question. We've never looked at it honestly. So I think people are afraid because all of us subconsciously know there's some ugly stuff under that cover. One of my favorite bands, a band called Arcade Fire, has this lyric: "If it's all right, how come you can't sleep at night?" All of us know subconsciously that something is not right. And it hasn't been right for a while. And so looking at that honestly and directly is literally the only way we get past it.
Thank you for that. And I have a few questions that were brought down, and I know there's more coming, but in the film it had a number of references to the tipping point. What key things need to happen in order for the ball to roll right this time?
You know, I love that question, because one of the things that I think I came to understand is that looking at all this history and reading this stuff, tipping points don't last. Like people say, oh, George Floyd was a tipping point. His murder wasn't a tipping point. His murder was an incident. Tipping points aren't an event or an incident or even a year. They're often a decade or longer, maybe 2 decades. And the stage presentation in this film was Juneteenth 2018, and the tipping point I described that we were at then is the exact same tipping point that we're at now. And so I look at this and I want to be as direct as I can. When you look at what happened on January 6th, those were acts of desperation. Somebody is afraid that America is about to take a different course on issues of racial justice and other kinds of justice. And they are so afraid that they're acting out like that. These are acts of desperation. Just ride with me for a minute. I don't know what you have heard about critical race theory or what you think about it, but it is a law school curriculum So when parents of fourth graders are screaming at school board members, "Don't teach my children CRT," and when 27 states have passed laws to prevent this, you have to ask yourself, what are people afraid of? Is your history so horrific that you're actually afraid to confront it? And so I think that people understand that if we actually confront our true history, good-thinking Americans, conservative, Democrat, liberal, Democrat, Republican, all those tags don't matter. People of good faith, understanding why America looks like it does today, would say we should do something to fix it, and we should do something that will actually address the problem, not address the myth of why the problem occurs. So I think this is exactly what it would look like if America was about to turn on a path toward racial justice that we've never gone on before. If there are people that don't want to go on that path, do you really think that they were just going to sip tea and crumpets and say, "Oh, our time has passed"? No. But I'm realistic as well. This is exactly what it would look like if we were about to roll back. And so this time, it's on us. It's not on our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents. It's on us. And our history will look back on us to ask what we did in these moments. And so my father always used to say, if you're really looking for stuff that will change, you've got to see stuff happening that hasn't happened before. When's the last time y'all had an event like this?
Never.
There are so many things that have happened that haven't happened before. And one of the things that I think I learned in a lot of the reading I did and in seeing this stuff up so close, and let me be clear, I am not an expert on this stuff. I came to this stuff in my 50s. I've been like rolling in this for 10 years, and I still feel like I'm so ignorant about what I don't know. And the fact that I could go that long without knowing most of the stuff in this film, it just still amazes me. But I have come to understand that there are people that say, don't get this twisted. Hope does not cause action. Action causes hope. And so if you are looking for a reason to think that America may do something different this time, I'm telling myself and everybody else, the first place you need to look is in the mirror. And what is it that you're doing now that you haven't done before? What action are you taking that you haven't taken before? What political step are you taking that you haven't taken before? What engagement with the members of your community, your family, your friends, people that respect you, to get them to engage in this kind of conversation? What have you done that you haven't done before? And I see people doing a whole lot of things that I haven't seen done before. And so that gives me hope. And I'm a criminal defense lawyer from Seattle. I don't know anything about making a movie, and these two women came up to me in a Starbucks and bought me, an ice cream and said, "Let's make a movie." And I said, "Oh, okay, why not?" And we did. So.
And it's pretty amazing. As all the scenes where Memphis were going by, I was in Memphis about a month ago at the Metro Chiefs Conference. And I spent about 6 hours at the Lorraine Motel and in the room across the street, and it was really moving. And the Memphis firefighters were kind of educating us on this tour. And I stayed so long, I broke away from the tour. I told my wife, that night I stayed there all day. I mean, it was so moving for me. But one of the things the Memphis firefighters told me was they moved the black firefighters out of the station that day, the day Dr. King was shot. And I said, why? How'd they know? And they just kind of shrugged their shoulders, and they moved them all to another station. And no one really had an answer, but they knew that happened. The Memphis firefighters knew that they moved all of the black firefighters. There's a station right across the street from the Lorraine Motel. There's a fire station there, and they moved them all out.
There's a fire station closer than I am to the back wall. from where Dr. King was shot. And not only were the black firefighters moved out, but my dad was really a remarkable man, and after he was a high school principal in Memphis, he retired. He became the foreperson of the Shelby County grand jury for like 25 years. And so a lot of the stuff from the King assassination was brought back up at different times. And I might have looked at some of it in a mirror or something. But not only were the black firefighters moved out of the fire station, but firefighters saw King get shot. And they called it in to the police. And Memphis Police Department said, nobody does anything until we get the 911 call, because they didn't want it known that they had Dr. King under that kind of surveillance. So I think what I know is that the reason those firefighters were moved out is because everybody in Memphis knew that, you know, there were threats against King's life. It wasn't like it was a shock or a surprise that something happened. So I'm not saying that the police or the fire department knew something was going to happen that day, but everybody in Memphis was on high alert that there was a good chance that something bad might happen.
And these are pretty amazing historical facts that we just never know about, and these are things that blow us away. But the next question is, the first scene in Charleston, the white man holding the Confederate flag. How do you broach that conversation with him or people like that? Do people mostly receive you well, or are they hostile sometime? How does that work out on the street?
You know, I think a lot of it has to do with how you approach someone. And there were things both on camera and off camera that Mr. Spivey said that I found very, very personally offensive. And I thought long and hard about my purpose. My purpose wasn't to let him know how offended I was. And I could have done that with emotion in my voice by yelling at him or whatever. And I could have walked away feeling like, okay, I showed him, I'm not going to take that. But that wasn't my purpose. My purpose was to engage him in conversation. And I wanted him to know that I knew what he was talking about. So when he said tariffs, moral tariffs, I said cotton, tobacco, and rice. And he's going in his head, oh, he knows what those tariffs are. So now we're having a discussion where there is some commonality. And you saw the results of that discussion, and you saw Mr. Spivey's face as we left that area. I'm not telling you that that man has changed his views. I seriously doubt that he has. I know for a fact that you can find him most Sundays in that exact same place on the waterfront in Charleston behind one of those huge Confederate flags. But he has contacted us since this film premiered in theaters at the beginning of this year. And he's very concerned about how he's portrayed. He is telling us, I am not a racist. If I saw a KKK person carrying that flag, I would beat them up. And here's my point. Something happened. And his views were impacted by that discussion, because I think he knew that discussion did not go well. And so something happened, and he is now wrestling with cognitive dissonance that he did not have before. And the only other thing I'll say is that you saw what happened on camera, but what you didn't necessarily see is that there were folks on the waterfront who were watching that discussion who did not appear on camera. And quite frankly, I was talking to them as much as I was talking to him. So I think, to be honest, my training as a criminal defense lawyer, which tells me if you're trying to cross-examine a witness and you start yelling and screaming, you may think that's really dramatic, but people just shut down and they're like, you know, when is the information going to start coming? I think that training helped me a lot. And the last thing I'll say is it was one of the most difficult decisions that I had to make to shake his hand, because I knew what he thought of me and my community. And I also felt like he didn't have to talk to me, and he agreed to talk to me, and he was civil. And especially if you're raised in the South, if you have a civil conversation with somebody, then you shake their hand at the end of it.
A lot of strength there. The next question is, what are your thoughts on the term gatekeeping and the term internalized oppression. How do we deal with that?
Well, I'm not sure, one of the things that I've learned as a lawyer is that people use terms and they use them radically differently. When you say internalized oppression, I'm not sure what that means. If you go to Scientific American, the most recent magazine, you will see an article about research that quite frankly has been confirmed since people who survived the Holocaust were followed. And what you're seeing is that trauma is passed on genetically in strands of DNA to generations that come after those who were traumatized. So that is one meaning of internalized, what was the term, internalized oppression, that I think is important to think about. And, there are many people that say, look at this and that in the black community. People always want to say, oh, look at Chicago and all the shootings in Chicago and black on black crime. What do you say about that? Do you know that 85% of all white people that are murdered by other white people? But have you ever heard the term white on white crime? You've never heard it in the American lexicon because it doesn't exist. If you want to know why there is quote unquote black on black crime, take a look at redlining and segregation. It's because black people and white people don't live together in America. We are radically separated in the neighborhoods where we live. And I feel like if people would think about some of the things that you saw, and one of the things that always haunts me is Tammy Sawyer, the young woman from Memphis, Tennessee, who says, I see the light go out in kids' eyes when they're 4 or 5 years old. And if you think kids don't understand the world or start understanding the world by that point, you are sadly mistaken. All of the research is showing that they're looking around and they can see who has stuff and who doesn't. And they can see images that are portrayed on TV. And they can see how people react. I'll never forget reading a book by a woman named Poe Bronson, written years and years ago. And she describes listening to a group of 6-year-olds say, talk to each other. And they're saying, don't talk about race with the adults. It gets them really upset. They get really nervous. They get really upset. So don't talk about that stuff. And it's like, where did they learn that? They're learning it from us. So if you're thinking, how young should I start teaching my child about these issues? Understand, they're learning it, whether you're teaching them or not. So it's not a question of should you teach them, it's a question of who is going to teach them. Because our society will teach them quite well, thank you, if we don't intervene.
Thank you for that. From one of the answers earlier, I get the feeling that you think there's an opportunity for us in the future because we're seeing things happen that haven't happened before. And that's really important that we recognize that, and you recognize that because you're all around the country teaching and educating. But the question I'll pose to you is, what role can our universities play in moving us forward?
That is a great question because universities have the ability to gather information, like the information that it took me 10 years to gather in this film. You could get 3 undergrads at the University of Washington who want to get their degree in history and say, over the next 9 months, bring me every document on redlining in the Seattle area. And the trove you would get would be amazing. So universities, I think, have a really important role to play, both with nonprofit organizations and with government organizations, so that, the city of Seattle should be able to say, if we're trying to figure out what did the red line policies in Seattle do to the Central District and the black community that used to be in the Central District and that is disappearing almost completely from the Central District? It's like, it ain't an accident. It's not by happenstance. There is actually a reason that it happened. And it's the beautiful thing about human beings. This is like the most racial thing that I found in all of of this examination. When I say racial, I mean human race. There was a band, I'm dating myself, a band in the 70s called Steely Dan, and they had an album, well, they had a song called The Caves of Altamira. And the song was about caves in France where they found 20,000-year-old drawings, intricate drawings of animals that were hunted, the scat that they left, their footprints, images of the tribesmen hunting the animals. This was 20,000 years ago, and most historians say that the Sumerians, about 5,000 years ago, were the first culture to really use written language. So at least 10 or 15,000 years before there was written language, these people were writing stuff down. And the Steely Dan song went before the fall, when they wrote it on the wall, when there wasn't even any Hollywood. When human beings think they're doing something important, we write stuff down. Every state in this country has a historical society. Every county in this state has historical documents that go back further than you would believe. And those documents are where this history lives. And so I think universities have a real calling, both in their teaching of their students and in helping the communities that they're in, to help bring this history forward so that you can say to the Seattle City Council or the Seattle Fire Department or the Seattle Police Department, did you know X? And now that you do, what is it that we should do to try and have an impact on, what that's caused today?
There's some ideas for the future. So here's a question. Have you seen examples of successful institutions that have addressed racist policies and practices that perpetuate racism? You've been teaching and training, you've been around the country. Who can we hold up as some positive examples?
I think the positive examples, quite frankly, are, I don't want to be pessimistic. What I was going to say is that the positive examples are examples that we are seeing in the last 5 to 10 years and hopefully are going to see into the future. You heard Dr. King say that a lot of the civil rights gains were cosmetic. And if you talk to activists today, that's exactly what they will say. So you got to eat at a lunch counter, so you got to ride a bus, so what? That didn't change anything. And there's a level at which they are right. But I will tell you this, I remember the look on my parents' face when all of us were dressed in coats and ties and dresses, and we walked into a restaurant in the early 60s and got served when there were white people sitting in that same restaurant. And the look of pride on their face about that event happening in their lifetime is something I'll never forget. So I want to say to the young activists, yes, those things were somewhat cosmetic if you are comparing them to the issues we're trying to confront now. You have to understand where those folks were coming from and the system that they were under and how much of a leap forward that was. And so what I would say is I can't point to any specific institution because, quite frankly, there have not been a whole lot of institutions that have tried to address issues of racial justice by looking at the truth about our past and how we actually got here. And that's what's starting to happen now. And I'll just give this as a last quick example. If you went to the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa today, you would see one of the most depressed black neighborhoods in America. You would see one edifice on Greenwood Avenue, the church that is owned that has black ownership. And you could look at that neighborhood and you could say, this is, another example of a black neighborhood that's not succeeding and they just need to work harder. If you had never heard about the Tulsa Massacre, if you didn't know that there were $10 million in 1921 money in unpaid insurance claims in the black community because it was a riot. If you didn't know that expressways were literally built over mass graves, and that the city of Tulsa 3 or 4 years ago started discovering these mass graves, and they started excavating them. And the University of Oklahoma said, we'll give you equipment for free to do it. And after they excavated 2 or 3 of the graves, the mayor shut the whole thing down, saying it would be divisive if we discover anything more, or if we go any further with this action. If you didn't know what happened in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, you would look at it today and say, I know what the answer is to fix this neighborhood. And your answer would be completely wrong, because it would be solving for a problem that didn't cause the Greenwood neighborhood to look that way. That's why our history is so important. If we would actually look at what brought us to this point, we could design solutions that actually deal with the cause of the problem. It's a radical idea.
So in the film, we heard and saw that lynching was a part of symbolism, the tree, the rope, and all those things. And before I get to the question, I'll preface it a little bit. Our first call I had with you and Andrea, I told you about some of the struggles that we were having in the Seattle Fire Department on race. And so I spent a few minutes educating Jeffrey and Andrea about our racial incidents in the Seattle Fire Department, open and honest, because we want to get better. If we want to get better, we got to talk about it, and we got to take bold, intentional steps forward. And we can't look the other way when these things happen. And, you know, seeing the film, once again, symbolism. It also said that oftentimes they didn't prosecute anyone, or they never found out who did it, or they knew who did it, but they wouldn't prosecute them. I think everyone knows about our struggles in the Seattle Fire Department on race. I haven't hit it at all. So now I'm gonna get to the question. We have had not one, but 2 noose incidents in our fire department discovered in fire stations in this city. 1 is too many, 2 is too much. Can you address how investigations of such incidents can be done in a timely, efficient, effective, and transparent manner so that those involved and impacted can move to resolution and healing? And there's another part, and I'll come to it after.
I think action often reveals your intention, right? I was saying that action causes hope. It's not the other way around. I can recall incidents in my career as a criminal defense lawyer when police officers were horrifically injured or killed, and the investigation that happened made it crystal clear to everyone concerned that this was a priority. So I think everybody who is in law enforcement already knows how to make it clear that these kind of incidents won't be tolerated. There's nothing, again, it's like, it's not a radical idea. It's actually quite simple. And I think that some of what is involved, because, you know, if you're putting a noose in somebody's locker or a noose on a desk, it's hard to say, well, the person really didn't understand what the noose meant. That's a hard thing. That's a hard thing for me to accept. But what could be very true is that that person has no idea that America lynched on average 1 black person every week from 1877 to 1950. I don't think they have any idea necessarily of what actually occurred. You know, you say lynching, and that covers a lot of conduct. And so the way that you make it clear that this behavior is not tolerated is to investigate it like it's not tolerated. Many people say that, I haven't looked at it, so I'm not commenting at all. I don't know what this bill that's coming out of the House and Senate about gun control. People are, both sides are saying it's either bad or not enough or too much or whatever. All I know is that you can have a bunch of kids slaughtered in Texas, and that ain't doing nothing. But have a guy with a gun show up in front of the house of a Supreme Court justice, all of a sudden we got a bill through the Senate. So I guess it depends at some level on whose attention that you're getting. But, this is a thing where we know the answer to this and we know how to do this. And so the question is, if that's not what was done, if there was not an investigation that indicated that kind of concern, then that's something that folks need to talk about and to talk about openly. Is that okay? And if it is okay, let me just finish this way. Y'all may recall a trial of the killing of a man in Georgia named Ahmaud Arbery. Well, the defense lawyers that made the argument in that case are 25-year friends of mine. I know them intimately. If you want to say they're bigots or racist, I'm like, bring your lunch pail, because you got a lot of explaining to do, because they have done all kinds of things that are anti-racist. But when they said what they said, I called them out publicly and pretty directly. And people came to me and said, how can you do that? They're our friends. And I'm like, yeah, they're our friends and they screwed up. How can you do that? They're criminal defense lawyers. We have to protect each other. I'm like, is this like a blue line or something where we don't rat on each other or we don't call each other to account? And one of the things I'd say thank you again about is I see kids in the room. And I know there are parents in this room. If your child does something horrible, how many of you are willing to say, let's not talk to the child about it at all? Let's not bring it up, because my God, it might embarrass the child. The child might feel responsible. The child might feel like he has to change his or her behavior. And for God's sake, we don't want to make the child feel bad, so let's just forget about it and pretend it never happened. Nobody would do that with their kids. So why do we think we would want to do it with an incident like this or with the history of our country? And that's why I think this stuff is so complicated, because at some level it's really simple.
The next part of the question is, do you feel that fire and police agencies are capable of investigating themselves when these type of race-related incidents happen, or should it be an absolute that we bring in an outside set of eyes to get a handle on this?
I don't think this has anything to do with fire or police agencies, and the example that I just gave you proves that. Criminal defense lawyers across America are saying, you can't Monday morning quarterback guess what they said. You can't criticize them because we have a hard job. We're criminal defense lawyers. We have to stick together. Those kind of feelings exist. It's called human behavior and human conduct. If you know somebody, it's a little bit more difficult for you to investigate that person objectively. I mean, there's no shame in that or anything. So for me, it's like, I don't think there's anything unique about fire department people or police officers. Look at any group in America. Look at the Catholic Church. And, you saw on this screen, the Catholic Church walked their talk in the civil rights movement in the Deep South in the 60s, because I wouldn't have had the life that I had. The reason we ended up at that school, St. Louis, is that the pastor came to our house and said, they are shutting down the black Catholic school, and you live nearest to my school, and I want you in my school. That's how we got there. There are all kinds of things, that are problematic with the Catholic Church. And one of them is investigating themselves. So I just don't think anybody should take it personally. This is not about fire or police. This is just about human beings. This is racial again. This is like the human race.
So the next question ties to, when you're having training, you're having these conversations, but you get the feeling that is falling on deaf ears, how do you maintain an energy level and a positivity to continue these courageous or brave conversations when it just feels like no one's paying attention?
I'm not saying anything that comes after this in false modesty. My wife will tell you that I'm a legend in my own mind, and my dog will tell you that too. When you say brave and courageous action, what I think of are the women in the Montgomery bus boycott and what they did for over a year just to give me the chance to get an education that could start me on a path to where I've ended up. And my wife gave me a present a couple of years ago, a little small medallion, and on one side there's an iconic picture of a woman sitting with her daughter on the steps of the Supreme Court with the newspaper headline Brown versus the Board. And on the other side is a picture of women walking during the Montgomery bus boycott. And one of the things that I will do, because I will tell you, I get tired and depressed and like, you know, what the hell am I doing and why am I doing this? And I look at that little thing and I'm like, so what am I going to say to them? It's like, oh, I'm tired. I'm frustrated, really, with what they went through, with educational capacities that I had that they never dreamed of. And, you know, they were turning an entire country around. This was like 7 years after Separate but Equal had been quote unquote outlawed. And don't for one second think that just because the Supreme Court said it was illegal that it stopped. We can see that today. But I think, you know, looking at people and the accomplishments that people have made that have come before us, I think every group in America can do that and say, you know, and that's why I said in this film, America has demonstrated greatness time and time and time again. I actually think that the work I'm doing right now is the most patriotic work that I've done in my entire career, because I actually love the country enough to say there is something seriously frickin' wrong and we've got to do something about it. And I'm not going to turn to my child that I love and say, don't worry about it. Just keep on doing what you're doing.
You know, we saw the slide a couple times about the tipping point. There's been a couple of questions about the tipping point. What do you feel is at risk this time versus 50 years ago or in the past? What do you feel is at risk?
You know, I think, and believe me, the thoughts that go through my head when I think about how old I am, I'm going to turn 66 in August, and you know I'm not maturing. I stopped that a long time ago, but I continue to age. And I remember what it felt like when the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were passed. I think, you know, while King called some of those things cosmetic, looking back on them, it's important to remember where that was coming from. It seemed like every single thing that could happen heading us toward racial justice was happening, and then it all ended on April 4th, or at least it seemed to, and practically speaking, politically speaking, it did start downhill from that point. I think what's different now is that the plateau that we reached in 1968 at the end of the so-called civil rights movement, that plateau was up here, where the plateau that we were starting from was down here, the plateau in, say, 1954. So we're starting from here, and we haven't advanced as much, but we're starting from a different place. And when you look at the Kerner report, that report that came out 3 weeks before King was killed, it's now 52, 53 years old. And you look at the wealth gap between black and white America that exists today, which is virtually the same, except it's increased a small amount in the last 50 years. The gap has increased. What I think is at stake, and I'm not trying to be dramatic, I'm just telling you what I think, and I'm one person. I think this is America's last best chance to get this right. Because if we roll back from where we are right now, I've been alive long enough to remember what it was like in those times we were rolling back to. And if we roll back on issues of racial justice, with 1 in 5 Black Americans living in poverty today, I don't know what we're rolling back to, and I don't know how long it's going to take us to dig out to get just back to where we are today. So I think there is a sense of urgency, but not panic. At least that's what I'm feeling. I definitely feel a sense of urgency. I had a very good job at the ACLU, and I was working hard, but I'm working harder since I left the ACLU. And I didn't do it, I did it because I thought this was important. And I think this is an important time, and it's a time where we can make a difference. I made this film. I had no idea that this could happen. This is reaching people all across the country and showing all of us how ignorant all of us are about our history. This history was stolen from every single person in this room, from all of us. And it's on all of us to get it back. So I think the stakes are very, very high, but I'm not panicking. And I understand it could go the wrong way, but it just feels to me like my experiences are telling me that if enough people confront this information, we have a chance to do something radically different.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. I got a few more questions. I got 4 sheets of questions. I'm only going to ask 3 more. But why aren't other histories from other marginalized communities included in the film?
That's a great question. And the title of this film was very, very intentional. Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America, not the Chronicle of Racism in America. When Sarah and Emily Kunstler came to me, and people have just said, Jeff, we can't believe this, but they came to me and said, we want to make a film. This is a film that you're making about your community, the Black community in America. We want to help you make this film, but we don't want to change it. So, number 1, you will own the film 100%, which allowed us to sell the film to Sony Pictures Classics and have all of the money, including future earnings, go into the Who We Are project. They also said you have 100% editorial control because we as white women can help you make this film, but we don't have the agency to tell the story of Black America. And so I didn't feel I had the agency to tell the story of Asian Americans or Latinx Americans or Native Americans because I haven't lived that experience. And that's why we titled the film A Chronicle of Racism in America. Having said that, the Who We Are project, which is the project that this film is the first kind of thing that the project is doing, has plans on what we're calling a truth tellers training, and we're going to bring in the best orators in America to train people from different BIPOC communities on how to do research and tell their stories. We will include Sarah and Emily Kunstler, who will help us with training on, if you've got a $100,000 camera, you can do a lot of things with it. But if you got an iPhone, you'd be amazed at what you can do with it. And if you got 3 iPhones, you'd be even more amazed at what you can produce. So we want to encourage other people, not only in my community, but in other impacted communities, to do this same thing. The last thing I'll say is, the presentation, the stage presentation that this film is based on, is 3 hours and 15 minutes long. So that tells you how much was cut out, because this film had not only that presentation, but all of the interviews that we did. So the editing of this thing was very difficult, but that's one of the things that is good about our future plans, because we have so much material that didn't make it into this film. the woman that answered the phone with the bomb threat at the 16th Street Baptist Church and didn't get killed because she was hanging up the phone instead of in the basement changing into her church clothes. People at the church in South Carolina where Dylan Roof went in and killed 9 people and injured a whole bunch more. These are all things that didn't make the film. So the Who We Are project will be using these things as we go forward to try and continue our goal of educating people about the truth about our past.
How do we pay attention and know when that's coming? Because it sounds like there could be something on the horizon.
You know, come to our website, thewhoweareproject.org. I will say, I'm trying to look for Andrea. Election, can I say that? Yeah, you're not shaking your head.
Yeah.
We're going to come out with a documentary with Tom Hanks and his production company, a short documentary of about 12 to 15 minutes about the presidential election of 1876. I referred to it in this movie as the end of Reconstruction. If you think our last presidential election was bizarre, buckle your seatbelts, because this one ended up 185-184 in the Electoral College, and there were telegrams that were passed 2 nights later between the Democrat and Republican candidates that essentially sealed the deal in this election. So we're going to release a short documentary before the midterm elections, just to emphasize to folks that it actually makes a difference if you cast a vote.
And one of the things we're going to do, if you register through the King County Fire Chief's website, we're going to send you a survey tomorrow morning, but we're also going to send you some information where you can plug into the Who We Are project and you can get notified information on what's coming. So that's one of our goals. And thank you to Eric Hicks for managing that King County Fire Chief's website and making the magic happen. You know, Jeffrey, you could have told this story without making it personal. Why did you make the choice to make it personal?
I will say that making it personal is one of the largest gifts that Sarah Kunstler and Emily Kunstler gave me. Because when we started this, I was clear, there's nothing about my life going in this, because this ain't about me. And when I called my parents unicorns, there are black folks in this audience that know there were black unicorn parents all over America doing the exact same thing my parents were doing. So the power in their story is that it wasn't unique. This is what black parents were doing all over America, making $1 out of 15 cents and making it work for their kids. So I kept saying, I don't want to make this personal. And Sarah and Emily finally said, you can stroll into Gwen Carr's house and ask her about watching her son get choked to death by the New York Police Department. And you can go to Tiffany Crutch's house and ask her about her brother getting shot to death by the Tulsa police. And you can ask Leslie Benningfield Randall, 100 years old, to relive an incident that was horrific. So shut the hell up and get in front of the camera. And I'm glad that they did. What I will tell you is, I met Opie Orions when he and I were both 6 years old. And the one part of the movie that was excluded that I complained about is the first day that we met, because we met on the playground at this Catholic school, and his family lived right across the street. He was one of 9 kids in an Irish Catholic family. And we're at the top of the monkey bars, and we just met each other, and he says, do you want to go to my house and get doodle bugs? And I said, sure. Do y'all know what doodle bugs are? It's just little grubs, and you take like an onion and you stick it in the ground, and the doodle bug grabs onto it, and then you pull it up real quick, and then you put it in a jar, and then you look at it, and that's what you do. So we went to his house to hunt doodle bugs, and 3 o'clock comes along, and my parents come to pick me up, and this is the first day that I'm in this all-white neighborhood, and I'm not there, and there's a panic. And the police are called. And Opie, in his southern accent, says, I remember the police coming in my backyard and they was looking for Jeffery thinking he had been taken. And he had just been taken by me to hunt doodle bugs. So the doodle bug story didn't make it. But maybe you saw that when Opie's older brother Dick, who was 10 years older than us, When he told the story about that basketball game in Mississippi, I had never heard that before. I remember that tournament like it was yesterday, but I'd never heard those details. And Dick Orions was 21 years old when that incident happened. And it was about 3 years after the civil rights workers in Mississippi had been disappeared for standing up for racial justice. I have no idea where he got the courage to do what he did. But he did. And when we screened this film in Memphis, when it opened in Memphis, it opened at the Crosstown Theater, where Opie and I were required to sit in the balcony to watch the movie Patton, which, by the way, was April 1970. And this time we didn't sit in the balcony. We sat in the big part of the theater. And Dick brought his children and his grandchildren. And so I got to tell his grandchildren before the movie started, take a very close look at what your grandfather did. So I got to renew my friendship with them, and that was incredibly special. So Memphis was the hardest part of this film and the best part of this film for me, I think.
Thank you. Last question, two-part. So we got a lot of leaders out there, and oftentimes leaders don't know where to start, or they don't have individuals modeling the behavior that they should be communicating to their folks. I mean, here in Seattle, we have Mayor Harrell, and he models the behavior, and he's clear, and he's intentional. And I know myself and all of our my peers appreciate that. But what if leaders don't know where to start? What advice do you have for them? What first steps should they take? And then the second part to that is any recommendations on things we should be reading, studying to continue the growth process?
Well, on the second part of the question, I will say come to our website because we've got all kinds of resources there. And part of what we're trying to do is to help people arm yourself for these conversations. You need to be armed, not with weapons, but with facts. So when Braxton Spivey says to you there were moral tariffs, you can say it's cotton, tobacco, and rice, dude, and that's 95% enslaved labor, and now we're having a very different kind of discussion. So for that part, come to our website and we'll direct you to a whole bunch of other places. I think this goes back to one of the earlier questions. It is so hard to begin to have these conversations when you don't know. It's like, I haven't done this before. And so take it out of a conversation about race, anything that's important, and you haven't done it before. You're going to be really nervous about it. And what I tell myself and what I try and tell other people is the real fear about these conversations is that you're going to say something and somebody's going to say that's racist, and you're going to go away, that's not what I intended. Or you're going to hear something, if you're an impacted person, that sounds racist, and then you're going to go, okay, what do I do with that? Do I say something? Do I let it slide? How do I deal with that? Somebody is going to get their feelings hurt. Somebody is going to get angry. Somebody is going to lose their temper and maybe walk away from the table, and you're going to have to try and figure out a way to get them back. And what I say to myself and everyone else is, don't worry about any of those things, because every single one of them will happen. And once you accept the fact that every single one of them will happen, it's easier. It's like, when you go to the dentist for a root canal and they stick the needle in and it hurts, but it's like you knew it was going to hurt. And that makes it a little better. And you get the root canal anyway, because you know that if you don't, what's going to happen is a lot worse than the pain of that needle. So the temporary, the kind of things that we are worried about they're deep and they're personal, and I'm not trying to trivialize them. But I'm just saying, if you let those things block conversations, then what you're saying is, to the impacted communities, I am not willing to be uncomfortable in order to move this forward. I just came from a meeting of criminal defense lawyers in Rhode Island, and we're trying to teach them how to do jury selection in cases where race is right at the center. And everybody is terrified about that. And the lawyer stood up and said, you know how long jury selection lasts? About 30 minutes. Turn to your black client and tell them, I'm not willing to be uncomfortable for 30 minutes in order to see if I can get you a fair jury. And when you think about it that way, I think it's just a little bit easier. So, the folks that are leaders, the leaders are rolling around in the mud with the rest of us. Everybody's trying to figure this out. Nobody has this figured out. And so if we're going about it intentionally and going about it in a way where we will come back to it after it was really hard and we're like, shit, I don't want to do that again, and we come back to it, those are the things I think that are going to take us to a place where we haven't been before.
We got some work to do. As I wrap up, I want to give a few thank yous to the King County Fire Chiefs for being willing to step out on faith, sponsor an event like this. My peers around the county, we've done a lot of good work over the last 7 years, and we're changing what the fire service looks like here in King County. I believe it's very intentional. But we're doing things like this. We're stepping out on faith, and we couldn't have done this event without our group and King County EMS supporting us with a financial contribution, and the Seattle Fire Foundation that we started in the last few years, another financial contribution. And we're going to try to do more things like this. I couldn't have done this. We couldn't have done this without our team stepping up from Eastside Fire and Rescue. Their newly formed DEI team, how about that? Stepping in to help us out tonight. Our PIOs, all the nice communications you've seen, all the flyers you've seen. It's definitely a group effort. We got a lot of work to do, but I believe we're standing shoulder to shoulder together, supporting each other. But most of all, I want to conclude with a thank you to Jeffery Robinson for creating this film, for being here with us tonight, for answering our questions, and being a resource that we can lean on. So please join me in giving...
Before you do that, can I just throw one more thing here? You may not realize it, but what this does, it allows us to go to every city in America and say, what do you mean you can't do it in the fire department? Yeah. Seattle Fire Department did it. And you don't know the kind of leverage that gives us. And Andrea is over here nodding her head. You don't know the kind of leverage that gives us. So that's why, if you're thanking me, I'm thanking you right back. Let's thank each other, because there's great things that can happen from this. So thank y'all.